Frank Lucas betrayed Bumpy Johnson. One phone call destroyed his empire in 7 days. The phone rang in Harlem, quiet as a hell breath. An insult traveled the wire. Bumpy Johnson listened, unmoved, knowing one calm decision would make enemies disappear or make loyalty bleed. The phone's ring cut through the quiet of Bumpy's office like a blade sliding along steel. Harlem outside hummed its usual rhythm. Footsteps on cracked sidewalks, distant shouts, the occasional slam of a door. But inside time stilled. Bumpy's hand hovered over the receiver, slow, deliberate. He had been expecting nothing. Yet here it was, a voice on the other end, sharp and hurried, spilling words that didn't belong to him, words that smelled of betrayal. He didn't flinch. He didn't curse. Silence was his first weapon. For a long moment, he just listened, letting the insult stretch thin in the air, letting the tension grow heavy between each syllable. Every second measured, every pause a question. Who thought they could challenge me so casually? On the street, corners that were usually alive with chatter seemed to hold their breath. Inside, Bumpy's associates waited, watching him, waiting for a sign. The calm in his gaze was deliberate. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't uncertainty. It was a signal. This was his world. One wrong move, one impatient reaction, and the balance would tilt. Then, just as suddenly, the phone clicked. The voice was gone, but the weight of it lingered. A storm had been whispered into existence, subtle but inevitable. Bumpy sat back, unshaken, knowing that what came next wouldn't be immediate. It would be slow, calculated, unseen. He didn't need to speak. Harlem already knew. The call had slipped through, but it would cost more than anyone expected. Bumpy stepped onto the streets like a man moving through a chessboard. Every glance, every nod, every slight shift of weight carried meaning. Harlem listened without words. The corner stores, the barber shops, the silent watchers leaning against the lampposts. They all understood who walked among them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A simple glance down an alley could settle arguments before they started. A calm word to a shop owner could redirect anger that might have spilled into violence. Power wasn't in the gun. It was in the restraint. Inside the pool hall, a group of young men eyed him nervously. Bumpy didn't flinch. He let them watch, let them wonder. Then, with the faintest of gestures and nod toward the door, he reminded them who ran this neighborhood. Respect, not fear, carved his empire. Even the enemies knew it. Across town, whispers traveled faster than footsteps. Bumpy's name wasn't shouted in bars or posted in headlines. It was murmured, and in those murmurs there was understanding. Cross him, and your mistake wouldn't just echo. It would vanish quietly, irreversibly. Harlem thrived under his hand, not because he ruled loudly, but because the city knew he measured every move. Every corner, every handshake, every favor owed was accounted for. Loyalty wasn't bought in a moment of fear. It was cultivated in silence, in consistency, in knowing that power could wait, but betrayal never would. By the time the sun dipped behind tenement rooftops, the city had realigned itself. Every person who mattered had felt the presence of Bumpy Johnson. The streets remembered, and in remembering, they chose where their loyalties lay. The room smelled of cigar smoke and the faint tang of expensive liquor. Bumpy sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but unyielding, eyes scanning every face as if he could read the intentions before the words were spoken. A whisper had traveled too far. Someone he trusted had stepped over an invisible line, assuming that ambition could outweigh allegiance. Bumpy didn't rise. He didn't slam a fist. He simply leaned back, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel the weight of his presence pressing down on every corner of the room. "Do you know what this means?" he finally said, voice calm, measured. Not loud enough to startle, but sharp enough to slice through pretense. The man across from him swallowed, unsure if the question was rhetorical or a warning. It wasn't anger that ruled here. It was certainty. Bumpy's power came not from the gun at his side or the muscle in the street. It came from knowing the truth of loyalty, knowing who would bend and who would break when the stakes were unseen. Outside, Harlem kept moving, oblivious to the quiet storm inside the apartment. But inside, decisions were being made that would ripple through every block, every corner, every man who thought himself untouchable. Betrayal was a slow poison, and Bumpy had mastered the art of letting it fester long enough for the guilty to reveal themselves without a single raised hand. By the end of the night, it was clear. Some ties would remain. Others would dissolve quietly, leaving a clean slate and a message. Loyalty was not optional. It was a currency, and every debt would be repaid. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with inevitability. Enemies thought they could force the pace. They expected chaos, shouting violence. What they got was stillness. Bumpy moved through meetings and back rooms like a shadow, never rushed, never betraying the storm he carried inside. Deals were made, favors recalled, debts noted, but all with a calm so absolute it unsettled even the boldest. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if his presence alone could bend time. One man leaned too close, a smirk on his face, testing boundaries. Bumpy didn't flinch. Instead, he placed a hand on the table, just enough weight to shift attention. Timing is everything, he said quietly. And some mistakes, well, they don't forgive themselves. No one laughed. No one argued. The implication was enough. Every whispered plan, every ambitious move by rivals, started to unravel, not through bullets or brawls, but through precision, patience, and the fear of making the wrong step under his gaze. Outside, Harlem's pulse remained steady, unaware that the game had already shifted. Inside, alliances were realigned. Friends leaned in. Enemies hesitated. Loyalty became a choice measured in silence, in observation, in understanding that the man who controlled this world rarely needed to raise a hand. By the seventh day, every move had been accounted for, every betrayal weighed. And while the streets still buzzed with everyday life, those who had tested Bumpy's patience now understood power had already claimed its winners and its losers. The room waited. Every eye was on him, every breath caught in anticipation. Bumpy Johnson didn't stand. He didn't pace. He simply sat, letting the silence stretch until it became a force heavier than any weapon. When he spoke, it was measured. Each word landed with the precision of a scalpel. No threats, no shouting, just certainty. This ends now, he said, voice low, steady, controlled. Not because I say so, but because it has to. The men who had doubted, who had whispered, who had miscalculated, their bravado evaporated. They shifted in their chairs, trying to find footing in a storm that didn't roar but moved with inevitability. Bumpy's calm was a kind of violence itself. It dominated without striking, reshaped loyalty without drawing blood. He went through the room methodically, acknowledging who had remained loyal and who had wavered. A look here and nod there, decisions sealed with subtlety. The ones who understood the code of respect left quietly, unscathed but enlightened. The others left with a quiet weight they couldn't shake. No one argued. No one resisted. The truth was clear. Control had never required theatrics. It had required presence, patience, and the unwavering understanding that respect earned was more powerful than fear inflicted. By the time the doors closed, the lesson was written into the walls. Bumpy Johnson had spoken. Harlem had listened. And in that silence, dominance had been achieved. Harlem had shifted. The streets moved differently now, quieter, deliberate. Conversations carried an unspoken weight. Storefronts, corners, barbershops, they all adjusted, subtly, instinctively. Bumpy Johnson's presence lingered like a shadow that stretched across every block. The men who had whispered, who had tested him, had disappeared from sight, not because of threats or violence, but because they understood the rules had changed. The loyalty that remained was sharper, clearer. It wasn't compliance out of fear. It was understanding, respect, and the knowledge that power worn quietly endured longer than any show of force. Bumpy walked the same streets he always had. Nothing had visibly changed. Yet everything had shifted. Deals that once teetered now stood firm. Rivalries had been realigned without a single gunshot. Harlem had remembered who commanded, not just the city, but the principle that held it together. His empire was intact, stronger than before. Every move, every misstep, every whisper had been accounted for. And while some stories of betrayal would fade into rumor, one truth remained. Bumpy Johnson did not need chaos to enforce order. Calm, measured dominance was enough to bend the world to his will. As night fell over Harlem, the city breathed with a quiet reverence. A man had spoken, and the streets had listened. His legacy wasn't written in headlines or blood. It was etched in silence, in loyalty, and in the unspoken understanding that power exercised with restraint outlives all else.